Hello and welcome to Cumberland Viewpoint. I'm Dave Johnson. Cumberland Viewpoint is brought to you in part by the Putnam County Family YMCA, and it is a community service of Cookeville Communications. Glad you could join us today. Going to expand the perspective of Cumberland Viewpoint a little bit to an international scale as we visit with our friend Pat Ryan, who is the president and founder of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. It's based in Nashville now, but got its beginnings in Cookeville, where Pat Ryan is a resident. And welcome to the show. Welcome back.
Thanks, Dave. Glad to be here.
Today, I want you to put on your World Affairs Council hat, and let's talk about the Middle East, and particularly Syria. First of all, tell us a little bit, for folks who haven't heard you on the show before, tell us about the Tennessee World Affairs Council.
Well, the council, as you mentioned, was established here in Cookeville in 2007, and the purpose of it, or one of a network of about 90 councils around the country, all share the same purpose of wanting to expand global awareness among people in our community. So we bring in programs and resources for the community and for our schools. For example, we've had a couple of ambassadors, foreign ambassadors to Washington, who have come to Cookeville and other cities in Middle Tennessee to talk to student groups, community groups, Rotary clubs, and so forth, just to help people get a better understanding of what is going on in an exceedingly complex world.
And you coordinate the Tennessee Academic WorldQuest for high school students.
Right, that's one of the flagship programs of the network of World Affairs Councils, and we took on that program here in Tennessee, and it basically involves getting high school students involved in learning about world affairs through the fun of a competition. So they 4 student teams prepare during the year for the competition, which will be held in early March, and the winners of that competition go on to the national competition in Washington at the end of April. It's basically a quiz bowl sort of competition. 4 students answer 10 questions in 10 different topics. The team that scores the highest, and these are current events and topical things. There may be categories like climate change in the world, international developments in health. There's a whole list of categories on our website, TNWAC.org, and anybody who's a high school student or knows a high school student, we hope they'll encourage them to get involved in that activity.
And those questions, are they pop questions? Do they have some idea of the general categories before
well,
they start?
what we do is we have a study guide that we pass out to the teacher or coach, whoever is helping the team get prepared, and the study guides list exactly where the questions will be derived from, and the students can read through those materials. And that's the whole idea, not so much the competition itself, but to encourage students to do a little more research and exploration of international events on their own time. But then the encouragement is that they'll apply that in a competition that might pay off in the long run.
And you have one student winner from each state each year?
No, we have one team of 4 that goes on to the national competition, and our council sponsors them not just to go to Washington for the competition, but we take them up there and they're escorted for several days to a host of international organizations and events. For example, we had a team from Montgomery Bell Academy in Nashville that won the Tennessee Championship this past year. We took them to Capitol Hill. They met Senator Corker, their Congressman Cooper. We've gone to think tanks and embassies, World Bank, all sorts of places in Washington that students normally would not get access to. They talk to decision makers and others on international affairs, how to get careers in Washington and international relations, what the different organizations do. So it's sort of a gold-plated opportunity to learn more about what happens in the world of foreign policy.
Yeah, sounds like an experience of a lifetime for a high school student. It would be life-altering.
It's definitely a lot of fun, and we've gotten very positive feedback. Of course, we've got some other prizes for the runners-up and others, but we think that the value in it is just getting students involved and engaged in understanding what's going on in the world.
If you're just tuning in, this is Cumberland Viewpoint. I'm Dave Johnson, talking today with Pat Ryan, president and founder of Tennessee World Affairs Council. And I primarily asked him to come over today to help us figure out some of the complexities of the issues that are surrounding the Middle East, particularly Syria, Egypt. Way more on that plate than we could possibly get to today. And as we speak, as we record this, things are happening so quickly. We are expecting a missile strike in Syria. It hasn't happened yet as we speak, but by the time this airs in a day or so, it's possible that that might have happened. So where do we start with this? It's such a complex issue. Where do you start with it?
Well, you rightly say that it's a complex issue, and it's sometimes you feel like you're trying to explain the inexplicable, but clearly this is important to our nation as we are on the edge of doing something militarily to react to Syria's use of chemical weapons against citizens in their country.
Right, and I should add that as part of, and really primarily your main job as the president of the Tennessee World Affairs Council is you are a writer, and you write a lot of articles for various publications, mostly online, that are designed to expand people's awareness and knowledge of these situations, and you interview different people, and you get facts and commentary from other people, and you publish those on several websites. One of them is called susris.com, and that is short for Saudi U.S. Relations Information Service.com.
Right.
And you frequently publish articles there that are read by many people. Who is the target audience for a website like Susris?
Well, you rightly point out that I've got several different hats, and as president of the Tennessee World Affairs Council, I'm a volunteer in that capacity, as are all the people who make up the staff there. And we all have day jobs, and mine, as a retired Navy guy, turns out to be someone who writes newsletters about Middle East affairs.
I should have mentioned, and I usually do, I've talked with you so many times now, many of our folks who are listening may not know this, but you are a retired Naval Intelligence Officer, Commander Ryan.
That's
right?
correct.
And you did several tours as a Naval Intelligence Officer, mainly where?
Well, I started my career, oddly enough, in Bahrain. The Navy promised to send me to whichever coast I chose. So I chose the East Coast, so they sent me to the Persian Gulf. They thought that was the right,
That's east.
The right connection. But I have served a number of times in the Middle East, and also in the Pentagon and at the U.S. Central Command in Florida.
You did some submarine time, didn't you?
I did. I was an enlisted submariner, and then after I got commissioned, I became an intelligence officer.
You got out of the submarine.
Well,
you surfaced, so to speak.
Right, and it's a long story, but most officers in the submarine force are nuclear engineers, and I'm more the liberal arts type. So after I got commissioned, I went to a surface ship and then became an intelligence officer.
So how many tours of submarine did you do?
I was a submariner for 10 years. I was a chief petty officer before I got commissioned.
You spent a lot of time underwater.
A little bit, yeah. Back in the good old days.
A lot of folks don't know this, but those guys, they spend a lot of time without surfacing. What was the longest that you were underwater at any given stretch?
We probably had about a 60-day patrol was perhaps the longest.
And then
at one
surfaced
stretch.
where?
Well, that was we came back into port in New London, Connecticut.
So you come back to port.
It was back in the days where submarines did all those Tom Clancy kinds of things that we can't talk about.
Right. And when was that?
In the 70s, and then I got commissioned after going to night school and college in the early 80s.
So you were underwater in the Navy when my dad was flying P-3s and
out looking for
doing
bad guys.
Submarine chasing.
Exactly.
But not you guys. You guys would coordinate though, wouldn't you?
We worked together.
With the
yeah.
P-3s.
It was a joint surface ship,
right.
Aircraft, submarine mission to find and chase the Soviet submarines that threatened the United States.
How many years in the Navy total?
26.
And so you've been out for how long now?
15 this month.
And I'll bet that's gone by quickly.
It has. It seems like only yesterday.
So you're writing articles now about Middle East situations like the one we have now in Syria. It just seems like they just come fast and furious. It just, as soon as one with the with what we call the Arab Spring. And maybe that's where you can start.
Well, it's probably a poor choice of words, and most people who follow these events are captured by it, but don't necessarily believe that's the right definition. It's a series of revolutions that have swept a large number of Arab countries, starting in Tunisia almost 3 years ago now, with the self-immolation of a protester, and then that spread to the overthrow of the Tunisian government, and that was followed by trouble in Egypt, Libya, Yemen. There were protests in Jordan, Bahrain, other countries around the Arab world, and what has become the civil war in Syria now. So all these fall under the umbrella rubric of the Arab Spring, but they, even though they do share some common features, revolts against autocratic governments, revolts by people who are desperately in economic troubles. They do have their own fault lines and character depending on the country, because the Arab world is a very complex makeup of religious sects and tribal patterns that really vary from country to country.
How many Islamic sects would you say are actually active and influencing events? Most people, if they followed at all, they may know Sunni and Shiite, maybe Wahhabist, but how many?
Well, those are the two main breakouts in Islam, and those are probably what people would most ascribe to the sectarian divisions that are plaguing the Arab countries, and in this case Syria. The ruler of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, is an Alawite, which is a subsect of Shia, and they're battling against primarily the Sunni. But in addition, there are 12 or 16, depending on how differentiation goes, of Christian sects within Syria, and a number of Islamic sects. You'll have subsets, Salafis, Wahhabis, depending on the country and the influence. Salafists have been operating in Egypt, for example. So there are a lot of religious differentiations, but the two main ones, the two that seem to be most in conflict in the Arab world, are Sunni and Shia. And Iran, which poses the greatest challenge to the United States in the Gulf, for example, is predominantly Shia, while the Arab and Iranians are not Arabs, they're Persians, but they're predominantly Shia, and across the Gulf, in, for example, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries, they're predominantly Sunni.
And you take into consideration the incredible complexity of the religious atmosphere, if you want to call it that, and people's eyes start to glaze over. But then you have to take into consideration the various allies of these countries that, well, as most people have heard, politics makes for strange bedfellows. And many people probably don't realize how much Russia is influencing what's happening in Syria, as well as our relationship with Saudi Arabia, not to mention Turkey, not to mention China, outside forces who have a lot of interest in these countries for various reasons, economic and otherwise. And how do you ever get your mind wrapped around it? Do you? I mean, you're probably as well informed on this as anybody.
Well, I was about to say, Dave, you're very well read because you've identified much of the problem that exists.
I'm well read because I've been reading your website.
The current convoluted picture is perhaps like no other foreign policy challenge that this administration or any other has seen in terms of the complexity of these relationships. As you mentioned, Russia plays a strong role in influencing events.
How?
As well as China. Well,
what's Russia doing there?
Russia is very interested in developments in the Middle East. Syria has been a historic client state of theirs. They have a naval base there. They've sold arms to Syria for years. They're interested in poking us in the eye in any way they can.
Seems like it, yeah.
And they hold a veto seat in the Security Council of the United Nations, as does China.
I didn't know this. perhaps I did, but I didn't realize to what extent. I didn't know that Russia, is it the number 2 or possibly close to number 1 oil producer in the planet?
Well, depending on what month it is, they generally produce more oil than any other country, but Saudi Arabia is the number 1 exporter of oil.
Ah, I see.
So they're close, and they're also, Russia is also a very large gas producer, and they pump a lot of gas to the European Union, which makes their relationship kind of interesting. But one other country that you mentioned in the mix there was Turkey, which is becoming increasingly important in the Middle East. And just to show you how complicated things are, a couple of weeks ago there was a crackdown after the coup in Egypt, and
wait, was that a coup? Is that what they call that?
Well, I'm not in the administration,
so a lot of people are trying to avoid that word, aren't they?
Yeah, they're still dancing around it, doing verbal gymnastics. But the crackdown and coup in Egypt revealed more fault lines, and in the case of Turkey, they supported the Muslim Brotherhood, and they were against the coup and the crackdown. In the case of Syria, they're on the side of cracking down on Bashar al-Assad. So you really need a scorecard with a lineup of the issue on one ledger and the country on another, and cross-check who's in favor of what action, and see which countries align with each other. Because there's
what you really need to know and be able to explain is your position on Miley Cyrus's appearance on the Video Media Awards this last week.
I heard something about that. But,
I say that because I've had several people say to me, it just astounds me that given the extreme complexities and seriousness of world affairs, particularly what's going on in the Middle East and chemical weapon usage and things like that, that most people are much more interested and fixated on what Miley Cyrus did at the VMA Awards. And I agree, that is an observation, but you know, that things don't change. That's pretty
if it
much.
Wasn't that, it'd be something else.
Yes.
We work from a small home office here in Cookeville, and we have a couple of different news channels going at any one time to keep up with things while we're working. And it's really disappointing to see how purported news channels really are celebrity gossip stations.
Commander Pat Ryan is our guest today here on Cumberland Viewpoint. He is retired from the Navy, a naval intelligence officer and former submariner, 26 years in the Navy, and is now the president of the Tennessee World Affairs Council, and writes a lot of articles for various websites that are designed to increase knowledge and awareness of world affairs, and he's an expert particularly on Middle East policy and issues and events. And I asked him here today, given the seriousness of American missile strikes in Syria, in the aftermath of chemical weapon use, I heard a quote from Secretary of State saying that they knew when these chemical weapons were fired. They knew where they came from, where they landed, when they landed.
The government laid out their case and identified, in particular, what they knew, and had concluded beyond any doubt that the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad was responsible for the chemical attacks. And there had been some naysayers who...
right. I was skeptical. I don't
Sure.
trust what I see in the news a lot of the time. But are you feeling pretty confident that it did happen and that it was something that was perpetrated by Assad?
Well, without a
his
doubt,
military?
there's much more evidence that the U.S. government and allied governments would have based on the 24-hour-a-day intelligence coverage of Syria, that they were probably monitoring all the developments leading up to the actual attack. And those who watch the news and see the news reports think that the government is reacting simply to the video that's shown on CNN or wherever they see it. But the government is, in fact, through the intelligence community of the United States and its partners in other countries, collecting intelligence all the time. So
plus, they have satellite imagery that is beyond what most people really realize as far as how closely they can scrutinize these kinds of movements.
Right, and I'm satisfied that when Secretary Kerry lays out the argument for the government position that the Syrian government is responsible for this particular attack, that they are going the extra mile given the lack of credibility that existed after the Iraq case.
Now you get the predictable political fallout, and this becomes a political football in American politics. Of course, not many Republicans are happy with anything that President Obama does, but not necessarily that surprising. Many people in President Obama's own party not happy with the decision of a missile strike for fear of further involvement in a military situation. How do you take in all of this?
I think you need to reflect a little bit on the catastrophe that Syria has become in the last 2 years. Clearly, the disaster of having over 100,000 people killed is a terrible tragedy. I'm not quite sure what could have been done at the outset or at what point along the way events played out something could have been done to prevent that. If you look at just the sheer numbers of people who've been displaced in Syria, 6 million people are refugees, 4 million internally, and 2 million have been displaced outside Syria's borders, which are destabilizing to their neighbors, particularly Jordan, and some of them going into Iraq. 1 million of those are children. And if you consider that Syria is a country of about 20 million people, that would equate to 100 million plus Americans suddenly displaced by virtue of violence in their communities.
It also borders Israel.
Sure. Well, we talked about how complicated these things are, and there's no shortage of actors who have an interest in what's going on in Syria. And there are some cynical enough to put forward the proposition. There was an article in the New York Times, a fellow named Edward Litwack made the case that whichever way the situation in Syria resulted, the United States would be a loser. And that may be true, but he contended that the optimum situation, I don't think he was endorsing it, but he, in purely theoretical terms, the optimum situation would be for chaos to continue to reign.
Well, and one of the things that I've heard pointed out that does point out a deep irony, and as well as perhaps some inconsistency in foreign policy, and that is one of the big complaints that I hear from Republicans and conservatives in general, that they perceive Obama as having a nebulous and vague foreign policy, in that in Egypt, where you've just had a huge crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood, where I don't know how many tens of thousands of people have been killed with conventional means.
Right.
Assad uses chemical weapons and kills a few hundred people, and we're ready to do a missile strike. But at the same time, you have this crackdown going on with lots more people dying in Egypt after a coup of a democratically elected president, and we aren't doing anything. How do you reconcile all of that?
It's impossible to reconcile some of these things that are occurring. There's really no one set of values that you can apply. The United States government, I think now, is grappling with the balance between interests and values. Because clearly we have interests in Egypt that argue against the Muslim Brotherhood, but as you pointed out, they're democratically elected. So we're balancing, our interest in a stable environment in some of these countries that have been traditionally under autocratic rule against chaos and what would damage our interests in the region if we were to act solely on our values. So it's a dilemma for the United States. It's less of a dilemma for some of the other countries. For example, Saudi Arabia is strongly in favor of the military-backed government in Egypt and is concerned about the United States' lack of resolve in supporting them against the Muslim Brotherhood because of our values. And meanwhile, there are countries like Russia that are not concerned about autocratic governments in the Middle East, and they will pick and choose whichever government serves their best interests.
And meanwhile, one of our biggest allies in the whole region is Saudi Arabia, which is an autocratic government, not democratic. And so it's a crazy puzzle. And I see a lot of pot shots and rock throwing at the president. And I usually want to say to those folks, okay, well, what would you do? What would be your answer to this? Okay, how do you deal with Saudi Arabia? How do you deal with Syria? How do you deal with Pakistan? How do you deal with Afghanistan, Turkey, Jordan? All of these, and they're all different. And a lot of Americans don't see the differences. They just see a big blur, and they don't realize that every one of these countries has its own distinct culture, distinct political environment, all differing in various ways from each other. How can you have a cogent foreign policy when the entire area is so incohesive?
Well, that's the problem of trying to rationalize between interests and values. Clearly, in some cases, our interests are overwhelmingly opposed to our values. But one thing I would add is that we are focused now exclusively on Syria. 2 weeks ago, we were focused exclusively on Egypt. But if you look at the big picture in the Middle East, we still have Iran to deal with. And every day that we're focused on something else, the centrifuges in Iran are turning, and they're producing enriched uranium and moving closer to the potential to have a nuclear weapon, which is not going away. They had a new president
Why would anybody want to be president? They'd have to be crazy.
Well, they get to ride in a nice airplane, I suppose. But other than that, it's a lot of headaches.
I guess. Our guest today is Pat Ryan. He is the president of Tennessee World Affairs Council, based in Nashville. He's a retired Navy intelligence officer, 26 years, writes a lot of articles. I read one where you were interviewing Ambassador Chaz Freeman, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and has been in the diplomatic services going way back to Nixon, I believe. And some really enlightening information coming from him, and one of those has to do with how we destabilize things when we took out Saddam Hussein. We gave to some extent Iraq to Iran. We put them in their orbit, as Ambassador Freeman puts it. That's something a lot of people don't realize, how much that's affecting the situations over there.
Well, that was really the first move that the United States made in this whole series of events in 2003 when we invaded Iraq after 12 years of containing Iraq through sanctions and the no-fly zone. Because Iraq, prior to their invasion of Kuwait in 1990 and then the Desert Storm conflict and campaign in 1991, Iraq had served as an effective bulwark against revolutionary Iran after 1979. So Iraq was sort of the wall against Iranian containment that has since fallen.
We're down to a minute. You said this was going to go fast and that there's more on the plate than we could ever get to, but I'm not going to ask you to make any predictions or express any opinions because I know you're a nonpartisan group, but you have been incredibly enlightening, and I think it helps people just to hear the context of the big picture and to hear how many different elements are in play here.
Well, clearly there's a lot that people can do to educate themselves on what's going on in the world, and no one television show or radio show, no matter how good you might be, Dave, will give everybody what they need. So I encourage them to look at places like theeconomist.com. And
your website, susris.com. I highly recommend it. Read some of the articles there if you're really interested in this area. And like you said, do your own research and see if you can put together a contextual analysis of this whole situation. It is amazingly complex. And
exactly. And also take a look at TNWAC, the Tennessee World Affairs Council, the TNWAC.org website. Get involved in some of the things we're doing. We're hoping to get people more enthusiastic about developing their own global awareness.
Well, Commander Ryan, again, I appreciate you stopping in, and I'll look forward to talking with you again, particularly when we get closer to International Night with Rotary, and I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Dave.